Hello everyone! Today we are going to talk about how we are supposed to understand and read the book of Genesis. So it is part of my Bible study on the book of Genesis, and today we're going to continue talking about Genesis 1 by discussing a portion of this book called The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John H. Walton. Ancient Cosmology and the Origins Debate. So this book is full of a lot of relevant information that is brought up in Genesis. But like I said, today we're going to be specifically talking about how we shouldn't read the book of Genesis in a wrong way. So let me share with you the things that I underlined here. We will only be talking about the introduction. So I'm going to read a few portions and then just give you my quick thoughts on them. And I hope this will be very helpful to you as you learn about the book of Genesis too with me. So here we go on page 7. In the beginning of the introduction. We like to think of the Bible possessively. My Bible. Here's my Bible right here. My Bible, a rare heritage, a holy treasure, a spiritual heirloom. And well, we should. The Bible is fresh and speaks to each of us as God's revelation of himself in a confusing world. It is ours, and at times feels quite personal. But we cannot afford to let this idea run away with us. The Old Testament does communicate to us, and it was written for us and for all humankind, but it was not written to us. So there's that distinction. It was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. The best way I can think of is if we were to write a letter years ago and I were to write it to someone, and then we were to fast forward to this time. Now we're going to read that letter. Obviously it wasn't written to me, but well, it's a little bit different, but the point being that the letter was written to someone specifically, in their context specifically, but now reading it later, we can learn from those times. We can learn, and the reason I say it's not completely like a great example is because the Bible was written with the goal of future people learning from it. So my example wasn't the best, but there we go. So it was written to Israel. The Old Testament was written to Israel. It is God's revelation of himself to Israel. Good morning. I would just add my personal thoughts on that would be, it was God's revelation of himself to Israel, written to Israel, but God, in God's mind, Israel was a key component to him sharing the revelation of himself to the rest of the world. But true, it wasn't being written to the rest of the world, it was addressed to Israel, to the people of Israel. So it is God's revelation of himself to Israel, and secondarily through Israel to everyone else. And first, second, that does not mean anything like, oh, we're not as important as Israel or anything like that. Like I said, God had a plan from the beginning, even before he founded Israel. He had a plan for the whole world. God's heart loves the whole world. As obvious as this is, we must be aware of the implications of that simple statement. Since it was written to Israel, it is in a language that most of us do not understand, and therefore it requires translation. But the language is not the only aspect that needs to be translated. So you might know this already, that when you read from your Bible, the Old Testament, obviously it wasn't written originally in English, it was translated into English. And so that presents something for us to be aware of. The language itself needed to be translated for us to understand it. And still to this day, there are some people in the world that have not been able to have the Bible translated into their language. So that's something that a lot of Christians are working on, that are passionate about doing that. But the language is not the only aspect that needs to be translated. Language assumes a culture, operates in a culture, serves a culture, and is designed to communicate into the framework of a culture. Consequently, when we read a text written in another language and addressed to another culture, we must translate the culture as well as the language if we hope to understand the text fully. Like I was talking to my daughter about this page. For example, the word that comes to my mind is, that is so cool. I grew up where that was the phrase, that's so awesome. You know, it meant awesome, fantastic, wonderful, like amazing, right? But if I were to write that down and someone later on maybe were to read that, they might think I'm cold, you know? But because in my culture, I grew up in that culture and that was the phrase, I knew like, oh, it doesn't mean that I'm cold, it means something else. So if we were to translate it into another language, I would have to translate it not literally, but in however that language will understand what I'm trying to say. So as complicated as translating a foreign language can be, translating a foreign culture is infinitely more difficult. And then, so I'm just going to just continue to look through the little sections that I underlined, just so you know what I'm looking at. So I'm going to skip a few of the explanations. It is far too easy to let our own ideas creep in and subtly, or at times not so subtly, bend or twist the material to fit our own context. So if you were to read Genesis and you were just not to learn anything about the culture of Israel at that time, then it's translated into English, it's very easy for us to come away with a completely different meaning than what was intended. In case you're not familiar, this introduction is very much what we call hermeneutics when we're learning about the Bible. So you can look up other books about hermeneutics, which is the study of how to properly interpret the Bible. On the level of words, for example, there are Hebrew words that simply do not have matching words in English. So that presents a problem, but like I said, the way that we would deal with this is just to consider, well, what does this word, like for example, here's an example. They say the Hebrew word, I think it's said, hesed, is a good example. The translators of the New American Standard Bible decided to adopt the combination word loving kindness to render it. So they pretty much used like two words to try to convey the meaning of that Hebrew word. And it's not to say that you can't trust what is the translation of the Bible, because the people that are translating, for example, trusted translations like the NASB, the New American Standard Bible, the one that I read from, 2020, just in case you're wondering. That's the year of this Bible. These people are the people that are most concerned with no one altering what the Bible is intending to communicate. So if you have reckless people just coming up with their own Bible translations that are not, they're trying to do their own thing to I don't know, for their ill motives, that's not what you have in most of our translations. You have people that are very they have studied the original languages and so forth. Going down here, there is a risk of us bringing something to the text that was not there, like we said already. Nevertheless, translators have little choice but to take the word out of its linguistic context and try to squeeze it into ours, to clothe its meaning in English words that are inadequate to express the full meaning of the text. So they're over here like trying to translate the Hebrew for us, but in a way that in our time and in our language, it's going to be properly understood. For example, when you translate a word like beautiful, how it's mentioned, Sarah as a beautiful woman, well, their way of thinking of, you can translate the word beautiful properly, but you'll come away with a completely different idea of beautiful than perhaps what they were meaning when they said that a woman was beautiful. So we might think of our examples of what a beautiful woman is in our time, So yeah, just another example. And for example, also the concept or the word, you translate the word marriage, but marriage carries a lot more social nuance than that in our culture, and not necessarily similar at all to the social nuances in the ancient culture. In that light, the word marriage means, skipping, like in ancient times, marriage was like arranged. It represented alliances between families, exchange of wealth. It's very, very different from the way we perceive marriage to include a lot about feelings, and we don't necessarily get our marriages arranged by our families or things like that, right? So we need to be careful when we are reading these words and we want to interpret what they were meaning in what we understand those words to be in our own culture. So rather than translating the culture then, so they're saying you run the risk then of trying to translate the culture. There are risks. For example, it says here, the minute anyone, professional or amateur, attempts to translate the culture, we run the risk of making the text communicate something it never intended. So here's what Walton is proposing instead. Rather than translating the culture, then we need to try to enter the culture. And I'm going to try to hurry up real quickly right now. Truly learning the language requires leaving English behind, entering the world of the text and understanding the language in its Hebrew context without creating English words in our minds, in their minds. They must understand the Hebrew as Hebrew text. This is the same with culture. We must make every attempt to set our English categories aside, to leave our cultural ideas behind, and try our best, as limited as the attempt might be, to understand the material in its cultural context without translating it. Okay, so how do we do this? Pretty much what Walton suggests is that by studying the cultures that were in the same time as Genesis was being written, we can best understand the culture of Israel itself. And I'll just read it real quick because it's really good. I don't want to just not read it. We can begin to understand the culture by becoming familiar with its literature. So the key then is to be found in the literature from the rest of the ancient world. Here we will discover many insights into ancient categories, concepts, and perspectives. To compare the Old Testament to the literature of the ancient world is not to assume, so we're not saying that we expect to find similarity at every point, but neither should we assume or expect differences at every point. So obviously we're going to read some Genesis, and then we're going to read other like origin stories from that time, and we're not expecting that they're going to be identical. But we're also not expecting that they're going to be so different from each other. We are going to find some similarities. These are, I guess, what I would call as culture neighbors of that time. Let's see. We believe the nature of the Bible to be very different from anything else that was available in the ancient world. So we're not saying that the Bible is just, it's the same as any other literature out there. That would be a very intellectually dishonest thing to say. If anyone is truly after the truth, that's completely wrong. The Bible is actually different from what I read. One way it's different is that the way it was received and even the way it was written was that it was God's revelation to them, and not, let's see, if we're going to read something like that. Because you know how we read about other cultures and we're like, okay, so this was what they believed, this is what they told each other, and maybe it was accepted because it was the community, like just the people that came before them. This was passed down to them. But you can't say the same thing about the Bible, because the Bible is saying this was revealed. This was God Himself revealing this, and it was treated in that serious manner, and it was preserved in such a serious manner too that no one could even like false prophets. That was like a death penalty, I think, back in those days. It was such a big deal, the concept of God revealing truth Himself to His people. We recognize at the same time that there is some common ground. Despite all the distinctions that existed across the ancient world, any given ancient culture was more similar to other ancient cultures than any of them are to Western American or European culture. Comparing the ancient cultures to one another will help us to see those common threads, even as we become aware of the distinctions that separated them from one another. As we identify those common threads, we will begin to comprehend how the ancient world differed from our modern or postmodern world. Even though today we believe in one God, the God of Israel, and therefore share with them this basic element of faith, the views of deity in the ancient world served as the context for Israel's understanding of deity. It is true that the God of the Bible is far different from the gods of the ancient cultures, but Israel understood its God in reference to what others around them believed. As the Bible indicates, Israelites were continually drawn into the thinking of the cultures around them, whether they were adopting the gods and practices of those around them, or whether they were struggling to see their God as distinct. It is to be expected that the Israelites held many concepts and perspectives in common with the rest of the ancient world. This is far different from suggesting literature was borrowed or copied. So here so pretty much, Israelites needed God to help them understand, hey, you know everything that you're seeing all around you? So that was their context. those were their religions. Our context would be the religions that are popular around us. And so God had to explain himself. He had to differentiate himself with that context of that time. And here comes like, be careful with how you interpret this information. We should therefore not speak of Israel. So what I said right here was that you cannot claim that Israel borrowed or copied just because you see certain similarities in ancient literature. And also we should not speak of Israel being influenced by that world. They were a part of it. And he gives the example of just as we are living inside a capitalist society. We're just in it. We learn a lot of concepts just by living in it. Like we don't necessarily we're not constantly talking about, he says, for example, self-determinism and individualism. It's just what we have absorbed from the culture we live in. We have absorbed how it's valuable, the way of living in our culture. Where did we learn the principles of naturalism or the nature of the universe? They are simply absorbed through the culture in which we live. One can find all of this in our literature, but we didn't learn it from our literature. It is simply part of our culture that we absorb, often with no alternatives even considered. So by recognizing the importance of the literatures of the ancient world for informing us about its cultures, we need not to be concerned that the Bible must consequently be understood as just another piece of ancient mythology. Because some people want to say, oh, well, it's just fake. It's just myth, Genesis, just like all the other mythologies. And here, I'm just going to wrap it up in my own words. In other words, he says, we use the word mythology to differentiate ourselves, or like we definitely do not agree with all those ideas of those gods and that those are the explanations for how the world began and things like that. So we're very quick to call it mythology, but to them, those were their ideas, those were their explanations. They truly believed that those things were the way that the explanation for the beginning of the universe. So this word mythology, it's repulsive to people, right? But we need to be aware that to them it wasn't mythology. We use the word mythology, but to them it was their worldview. It represents what let's see, Genesis 1 represents what the Israelites truly believed about how the world got to be how it is and how it works, though it is not presented as their own ideas but as revelation from God. The fact that many people today share that biblical belief makes the term mythology unpalatable, but it should nevertheless be recognized that Genesis 1 serves the similar function of offering an explanation of origins and how the world operated, not only for Israel, but for people today who put their faith in the Bible. So pretty much don't discount Genesis as just mythology. I forgot to mention this, so I'll include it here. Walton says that, what we would call mythology for the people back in those days, our mythology today would be more so what we hold to, which is what science has told us. So although science is all about not addressing deity and at the same time not disproving it, those would be the explanations that we hold to in our times. Alrighty, so that was the introduction, you guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Leave me questions. Maybe I can look for those answers as I read along in this book, and I will be coming on again to continue to share with you what we can learn about how to read Genesis properly. Alrighty, bye guys. See you on the next video. Remember to like and please give me a share. Thanks. Hi guys, thank you so much for checking out my channel. I want to invite you to join my newsletter. Every month I will send you a short thought that I have about the Bible and about how I just share how the month has gone and for me personally. And I also share my video that I worked on the month so that you can have those links and check out the ones that you're interested in seeing. Maybe YouTube didn't share it on your feed, or you didn't see it for whatever reason. But I also share what is coming up in the future, if I'm going to be interviewing anyone, or just what we're working on. I also share blogs if I write some and you didn't get an email being notified by it. You can also do that when you subscribe to get my newsletter. You're also going to be getting updates if I'm sharing blogs about different topics. I'm going to be writing one about just the election and how I am going to vote despite how messy politics are. So that's just a little view into what I'll be working on later on today. But yeah, please go ahead and sign up to my newsletter. It is www.susanmorales.org.